Snow lashed against the barn walls in long, screaming gusts, each blast rattling the loose boards and moaning through the chinks as if the wind itself were hunting for a way inside. The lantern on the post swayed, throwing uneasy shadows over the hay-strewn floor. Clara Wesson stood at the stove's edge, the warmth just brushing her front while the cold crept at her back, a double-barreled shotgun balanced across her forearms. The storm had risen fast. By dusk, the ridge was swallowed whole, sky and ground buried beneath the same furious white. Nights like this kept most folk tight indoors. Nights like this, any sound from the dark was a summons worth fearing. She told herself the faint noise had been the wind, a trick of the weather. But then it came again, low, muffled, and far too solid. Not a branch breaking, not ice sliding from the roof. Someone. Her eyes cut to the small frost-rimed window, though it showed only a moving curtain of snow. She pulled her coat from the peg, the leather stiff with cold, and stepped into boots still dusted from her last trip to the feed shed. The shotgun felt heavier than usual, not from the metal, but from what it meant she might need to do. Outside, the cold slapped her cheeks raw in seconds. Snow climbed to her shins, tugging at her steps. The wind stole her breath, and she turned her face toward the barn out of instinct more than sight. Lantern light glimmered faintly within, though she'd left it dark earlier. She tightened her grip on the gun and pushed through the drift. Another sound reached her, with understrain, a grunt muffled by wind. She rounded the corner and saw the barn door trembling, its latch half lifted, as if forced from inside. A shadow shifted behind the narrow gap. "Hold it right there." The words tore from her throat, sharper than she intended. But the figure didn't halt. The door shoved wide enough for a man's shoulder. Then more, a whole frame, broad, heavy under ragged furs. Snow clung to him in hard patches. His beard hung ice and brittle. Even through the whirling flakes, she saw the glint of eyes searching the interior like he already belonged there. "I said stop." Her voice cracked this time, and she lifted the barrel to match her intent. The man turned, saw her, and then, ignoring both command and weapon, stumbled past the threshold into the barn. It wasn't a rush, more surrender to gravity. His legs folded, dropping him to one knee, then both. Breath heaved from him in ragged clouds. That's when she noticed the dark stain along his left side, the way the fur there clung wet to him, the way he cradled it with a hand stiff from cold. Clara stayed just inside the doorway, snow piling at her boots, the wind clawing to follow her in. Every instinct told her to end this now. Force him back into the storm, close the latch, and let nature take the trespassers due. She had no reason to believe he was anything but trouble. She had no reason to risk herself, her home, or what little she still had. But her finger, resting on the trigger guard, wouldn't curl tighter. Something in the way he swayed, in the way his gaze locked on the floorboards rather than her, stopped her. Not defiance, not plea, just empty exhaustion. "What do you want here?" she demanded, her voice steadier now that she was inside the barn's dim shelter. The man looked up, slow and deliberate, as if moving through mud. His voice came out raw, almost lost beneath the storm's howl. Shelter. The single word seemed to cost him. "You picked the wrong place," she shot back, though her tone was less certain than before. He gave no argument, no story to soften his intrusion, only lowered himself sideways onto the hay, as though the conversation were over. She took a single step closer, still aiming. "You're bleeding," she said, before she could stop herself. His gaze met hers, and for a heartbeat, she thought he might answer. Instead, he closed his eyes. Wind battered the door behind her. She considered letting it shut him in and walking away. But this barn was hers. Everything in it, hay, tools, stock, was hers. Leaving him in here was as much an intrusion as letting him into her home. And yet she could already see what sending him back outside would mean. In this storm, with that wound, he'd be frozen solid before midnight. She eased the door shut against the wind, the latch clinking into place. The sound felt like a choice made. She didn't lower the gun. "If you mean harm, you'll find yourself in the snow before you can stand again," she warned. One corner of his mouth lifted. Not a smile, not exactly, but he gave a shallow nod, eyes still closed. His breathing slowed from ragged gasp to something steadier, though each draw was edged with a wince. She pulled a rag from the wall peg, tossed it near his side. For the bleeding, he didn't reach for it immediately, but when he did, it was with a care that suggested the pain was worse than he'd let show. She watched the way his fingers moved, deliberate practice, binding the cloth without fumbling. A man who'd tended his own wounds before. Clara shifted her stance, keeping the gun angled but not square on him now. The storm rattled the roof, reminding her that the night was far from over. In her mind's eye, she saw herself 2 years back, kneeling in snow of another winter, her husband's body cradled in her arms, breath gone cold. That had been the first night she'd held a gun with intent. This night, she felt the same edge inside her, but it was tangled with something else she didn't care to name. A sharp crack outside broke her from thought, a branch on a weight of ice or something heavier. She glanced toward the shuttered window. The man's eyes opened at the sound. "They'll find me if I go back out," he said, voice a little stronger now. "And you'll be next." Her breath caught. "Who?" she asked, though part of her didn't want the answer. He rolled onto an elbow, wincing at the motion, and fixed it with a look that was both warning and confession. "Not the law," he said simply, and in the pause that followed, the wind seemed to hush as if to hear what came next. Men with rifles, men who don't leave witnesses. Her grip on the shotgun tightened until her knuckles whitened. She thought the storm was the danger tonight, but as his words settled into the space between them, she understood that the weather was just a veil. The real trouble was out there in the dark, and possibly already closing in. The barn smelled of damp hay and old wood, the air warmer than outside, but still carrying the bite of the storm. Clara stood a few paces from the stranger, her breath slow and deliberate as she weighed her next move. His warning echoed in her head. Men with rifles, men who left no witnesses. She had lived long enough on this ridge to know that trouble didn't need much reason to find you, and once it did, it rarely left quietly. Still, letting a wounded man freeze under her roof was something she could not quite bring herself to do. She fetched a dented bucket from the corner and crossed the stall where a half-frozen water trough sat, breaking the crust of ice with the back of a shovel. She filled the bucket and brought it over, setting it within his reach without lowering her guard. He reached for it slowly, his fingers shaking as he lifted it. But he drank deep, the sound of water against his throat oddly loud against the storm's muffled roar. "What's your name?" she asked at last. He wiped his mouth on the back of his sleeve and looked at her for a long moment before answering. "No name that would matter to you." Her jaw tightened at the evasion. "It matters to me if I'm keeping you alive." "You're keeping me alive because you're decent," he said. "Names don't change that." His tone was calm, but his eyes flicked once toward the barn door, as if measuring the distance. Clara didn't press. She had learned in hard ways that pressing a man often made him shut his mouth for good. Instead, she turned toward the stall where her lone mare stood, restless in the noise and scent of a stranger. The mare was all she had left of the breeding stock her husband once tended. Keeping her alive through the winter meant long days hauling hay from dwindling stores, mending fences with frostbitten fingers, and hoping no predator tested the perimeters. The hours passed slow. She left him enough space to tend his wound, but kept her eye on him, noting the way he moved with measured care, never wasting motion. Even in pain, there was a precision to him, a man accustomed to hardship. When she finally went to fetch more firewood from the house, she thought briefly about locking the barn door behind her, but the storm's howl made the thought seem foolish. No man in his condition would willingly walk back into that. Morning came pale and brittle. The storm had eased but left drifts waist-high against the windward side of the barn. Clara fed the mare, then found the stranger awake and sitting upright, his eyes clearer than the night before. "You should be gone before midday," she told him. "I don't want your trouble here." His answer was simple. "It's already here." She was about to ask what he meant when she heard it. The faint crunch of hooves on snow, deliberate and heavy. Clara stepped to the small side window, brushing frost on the glass with her sleeve. 3 riders emerged from the stand of pines, their horses dark against the white, steam curling from the animals' nostrils. The men rode in a tight line, shoulders hunched against the cold, wide-brimmed hats pulled low. Each carried a rifle slung across the saddle. They didn't come to the barn first. Instead, they turned toward the house. Clara's stomach knotted. She looked at the stranger. He met her gaze without flinching, but there was no plea in his expression, only acceptance, like he'd been through this before. Clara stepped into the snow, the cold biting her face anew. The lead rider pulled up short in front of the porch. "Ma'am," he said with a curt nod. His voice carried the clipped tone of a man used to being obeyed. "We're tracking someone. Big man, beard, injured. Dangerous. You seen anyone?" She felt the lies settle on her tongue before she could stop it. "No one's been through here since the storm started." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. The one to his left scanned the barn, and for a moment she thought he might dismount. But the leader said only, "If you do, you'll want to let us know, for your own safety." They lingered long enough to make their suspicion known, then turned their horses back toward the tree line. Clara stayed on the porch until the sound of hooves faded. Only then did she let her breath out slow. When she returned to the barn, the stranger was standing, unsteady, but on his feet. "You lied for me," he said. "You didn't give me much choice," she answered, though they both knew she'd had won. He nodded once, almost in respect, then surprised her by asking, "You got fenced down on the east side." Saw it through the cracks when the wind shifted. Cattle wander if you don't fix it. It took her a beat to process that he'd noticed. Then she fetched tools and led the way. The snow was deep, the cold cutting, and his pace was slower than hers. But he worked without complaint. They set posts back into the hard ground, tying wire with hands gone stiff from frost. Clara saw then that his strength came not from bursts of force, but from endurance. Back at the barn, he didn't thank her for the shelter, nor she him for the work, but there was a mutual recognition that hadn't been there before. She cut 2 thick slices of bread, handed one over without a word. He took it, eating slow, as if each bite was weighed. That night, Clara woke to the sound of him murmuring in his sleep. At first, she thought it was nonsense, but then she caught the name, Sarah. The tone was heavy, aching, the way a man speaks when he's carrying a loss too deep for daylight. She didn't move, didn't speak, just listened until the wind swallowed his words. She lay awake afterward, staring into the dark, torn between wanting to know more and fearing what the truth might cost her. Somewhere beyond the barn walls, a wolf's howl carried over the snow. The mare shifted uneasily in her stall. Clara's hand found the shotgun resting by her bedroll, not for the wolf, but for the uneasy sense that the danger closing in on her had nothing to do with teeth or claws. In the morning, the stranger's coat was gone from the peg where she'd hung it to dry, tucked instead beneath the hay by his bedding. A deliberate act, she realized. If the riders came again, he wanted nothing in plain sight that tied him to her. The thought unsettled her. It meant he was planning for them to return. And when they did, she feared she might not be able to lie so easily a second time. Dawn broke in a brittle wash of pale gold over the ridge, the snow glittering under the light as though it had swallowed every star from the night before. Clara woke to the sound of the stranger moving quietly in the barn, his steps deliberate, the scrape of a bucket over packed earth. She rose, pulling on her coat, and found him bent near the mare's stall, checking her hooves with a competence that spoke of long familiarity with stock. He glanced up, but didn't straighten. "She's sound," he said. "Cold's got her stiff, but she'll walk it off." "You planning to earn your keep?" Clara asked, not unkindly. "Planning to leave before I wear it out," he replied. There was no resentment in his tone, just a fact, delivered plain. She studied him a moment, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper than she'd first thought, the set of his jaw marked by both stubbornness and fatigue. Over coffee at the workbench, he finally gave her a name, Elias Hart. The syllables landed heavy, not like something offered, but like something returned after being long kept. "I was a trapper, up in the Bitterroots, before the snow came early. I stumbled on a camp I shouldn't have. Men moving whiskey and guns. They saw me, I ran. Shot one when he came after me. Now they want it paid back." Clara set her cup down, the tin ringing faintly against the wood. "Those riders—" "They're not law," Elias said, cutting her off, "just wearing it like a mask." Silence stretched between them, but it was not empty. Clara understood enough about grudges on the frontier to know how they ended. One side buried in snow or earth. She also knew that men like Elias didn't often get second chances. Shelter was a temporary mercy. Survival was another matter. By midday, the air shifted. Quieter, too quiet. Clara felt it first in the stillness of the mare, ears twitching toward the pines. She stepped outside, scanning the ridge, and saw movement through the trees. 3 riders again, but this time their path was deliberate, circling wide to flank the barn. The glint of sunlight on rifle barrels was unmistakable. She ducked back inside. They're here. Elias didn't ask who. He crossed the far wall, checking the small gap between boards where light leaked through. His shoulders tightened. They'll try to pin us in, he said. You got a rifle? She handed him one from the rack, the stock worn smooth by her husband's hands. For a brief moment, her gaze caught on the weapon, a rush of memory threatening to slow her. She pushed aside. You'd better be worth the bullets. The first shot splintered the barn door before the words had cooled. Clara dropped behind a stack of hay bales, pumping the shotgun and firing back through the gap between boards. The smell of gunpowder clung heavy in the cold air. Outside, horses screamed at the noise. Elias moved with practiced economy, his shots measured, not rushed, even favoring his wounded side. He used the barn's cover to his advantage, shifting angles before each return fire. Snow kicked up in sharp bursts where bullets struck outside. One of the riders cursed, his voice carrying. Hand him over, and we'll leave you breathing. Clara's answer was a single shot that punched a hole through the barn's siding inches from his words. She felt no hesitation now. These men had brought the fight to her threshold, and she'd met trouble head-on before. The storm had taught her to endure. This was no different, only louder and hotter. Elias caught her eye, a brief, unspoken agreement passing between them. They shifted positions, trading cover, each movement forcing the riders to stay at a distance. But the men outside weren't simply charging in. They were waiting, testing for a slip. The sound that broke the standoff wasn't another shot, but a howl, long, sharp, and closer than the last time. Another joined it, then a third. The wolves had been shadowing the ranch for days, but now the gunfire had drawn them near. Clara saw the first shape dart between trees, gray against white, low to the ground. The rider saw them too. One cursed loudly, spurring his horse. The sudden movement threw their aim, and Elias took the opening, sending a round that struck the man in the shoulder, spinning him from the saddle. His horse bolted, vanishing into the timber. The other 2 turned their rifles toward the wolves, which only scattered to regroup. Clara used a distraction to rush the door, firing twice in quick succession. One rider wheeled his horse hard, retreating toward the trees, but the last remained stubborn or desperate. Elias limped into position, bracing himself against the beam, and fired. The man toppled into the snow. Still, the wolves didn't linger. Gunfire and fresh death kept them wary. Soon only the wind remained, carrying away the scent of blood. Clara's breathing slowed, her chest tight but steady. She lowered her shotgun and crossed the door, scanning the tree lean. No more movement. Elias leaned the rifle against the wall and sank onto a bale. The color had drained from his face, the exertion reopening his wound. Clara knelt beside him, pulling back the makeshift bandage. You'll need more than a rag now, she said. I'll manage, he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. As she worked, his eyes drifted past her, fixed somewhere far away. Sarah was my wife, he said quietly. Lost her to fever 2 winters ago. Thought I'd learned how to live alone. Turns out I hadn't. Clara tied the bandage tight, her hand steady even as his words settled into her chest. She didn't answer, because nothing she could say would change the truth they both lived with, that some losses never shrank, only shifted shape. By the time the sun began to sink, Elias had gathered what little he carried. I can't stay, he said. Not after today. They'll send more. You could wait for the thaw, Clara offered, though her tone made it sound more like a question to herself. He shook his head. Storm's over. Best to move while I can still cover ground. She walked with him to the edge of the drift where the path cut toward the ridge. His figure was broad against the pale horizon, the wound slowing his stride, but not stopping it. He turned once, offering her the smallest of nods, a gesture that felt heavier than words. Clara stood there until he was swallowed by the trees, the sound of his steps fading into the hush of snow. The barn loomed behind her, quiet now, the air carrying only the faint scent of powder and pine. She thought of the storm's first howl, of the shadows staggering toward her door, of the choice she made with the latch in her hand. Sometimes survival was a matter of holding ground. Sometimes it was knowing when to let someone go. And sometimes she realized it was both. The night after Elias left was the kind that pressed close, cold seeping through every seam in the walls, wind curling under the door like it was trying to take root inside. Clara lay on her bedroll in the house, staring at the rafters. The barn was too far to hear over the weather, yet her mind kept drifting there. To the sound of Elias's measured steps, the way his voice carried a kind of quiet certainty, even when he was bleeding. She had sent him out into the wilderness because it was the only choice that seemed to keep trouble from her door, yet the stillness he left behind felt heavier than his presence ever had. Morning came without color, the world outside blanketed in a sullen gray. Clara moved through her chores mechanically, feeding the mare, checking the fence lines, bringing in firewood, but her eyes were drawn again and again to the ridge where Elias had vanished. She told herself it was only to watch for any sign of riders returning. The truth gnawed at her in silence. She wanted proof he had made it clear of danger. That proof came in a form she hadn't expected. Near midday, a shadow appeared at the far end of the meadow, stumbling, then collapsing in the snow. She grabbed her shotgun and stepped outside, boots crunching over frozen crust. The wind shifted, and she saw it wasn't Elias. It was one of the riders who'd escaped the fight. His coat was torn, blood marking his shoulder, his eyes wild with exhaustion. Clara approached cautiously, the muzzle of the shotgun steady. "Where is he?" she demanded. The man's breath came in ragged bursts. "Didn't get him," he rasped. Snow took his trail. Wolves took the others. He tried to push himself up, but his strength gave way. "They'll send more not for him for you. You lied to us." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. She stepped back, weighing the danger of letting him live against the stain of killing him. In the end, she turned away. "Get off my land," she said, voice hard as frost. "Don't come back." The rider staggered toward the tree line, disappearing without another word. She knew he might die in the snow, but if he lived, his message would be carried to others. That meant her reprieve was short. By evening, the first signs of a new storm rolled down from the peaks, low clouds, the taste of snow in the air. Clara prepared for a siege. She moved her ammunition into reach, barred the barn door from inside, and brought the mare into the inner stall. The stillness between gusts of wind was the kind that warned of something breaking loose. It was deep into the night when the sound came, a muffled thud against the barn wall, then another, followed by the creak of wood underweight. Clara positioned herself behind the hay bales, shotgun braced, eyes locked on the door. The latch rattled but held. A pause and a low voice, almost swallowed by the wind. "Clara." Her grip tightened. The voice came again, stronger. "It's me." She edged to the door and lifted the bar just enough to peer out. Elias stood there, snow crusted on his beard, eyes rimmed red from cold and fatigue. His shoulders sagged with the weight of a pack slung across his back. "They're coming," he said simply. "Half a day behind me." She opened the door enough to let him in. He dropped the pack on the floor, pulling free a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were 2 boxes of ammunition and a length of oiled rope. "Took these off one of the camps. They'll follow my trail here." Clara didn't ask why he hadn't kept moving. She already knew. Survival out here wasn't always about fleeing. It was about choosing where you'd make your stand. And Elias had chosen here. They worked in silence through the next hours, shoring up weak spots in the barn, stacking hay bales for cover, setting the rope for a makeshift trip line near the fence. The cold gnawed at fingers and ears, but they moved with steady rhythm, a wordless agreement passing between them in each glance and nod. The attack came with the first light of dawn. Shapes moved against the snow, dark and deliberate, rifles glinting in the pale sun. Clara counted 4. They came in low, using the drifts for cover, but the crunch of their steps carried in the cold air. Elias took position by the east wall, Clara by the door. The first shot cracked sharp, splintering with inches from her face. She answered with 2 of her own, sending one man tumbling into the snow. Elias's fire was slower, measured, but each shot found its mark, forcing the attackers to keep their heads down. The fight was relentless. Bullets tore through the barn siding, showering splinters into the air. Clara felt the burn of graze along her arm, but kept firing. Elias shifted to cover her when her shotgun ran dry, his jaw set, eyes sharp. The trip line caught one man mid-charge, sending him sprawling, and Clara ended his rush with a single blast. When the last man fell, the silence that followed was startling. Only the wind moved now, sweeping over the drifts, carrying away the scent of gunpowder. Clara leaned against the doorframe, her breath cloudy in the cold, her pulse still hammering. Elias lowered his rifle, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in hours. "They won't be back," he said. It wasn't a boast, just a fact. Clara looked out over the snow, at the still forms half buried already by drifting powder. She thought of the quiet life she'd tried to hold on to, the boundaries she'd drawn to keep it safe. But the frontier didn't honor boundaries. It tested them, tore them, and sometimes erased them entirely. Elias shouldered his pack again, wincing as the strap crosses wound. "Time for me to go," he said. "You could stay," she offered, surprised in herself. He shook his head. "I'd bring more trouble, and you've got enough fight in you without me here." She didn't argue. They stood in the open barn door, the cold spilling around them, the sky a pale wash over the ridge. He stepped into the snow, leaving deep prints that would fill by nightfall. Clara watched until he was a shadow among the pines, then turned back to the barn. The air was thick with the scent of hay, wood smoke drifting from the stove in the corner. She set the shotgun back on its rack, the weight of it familiar in her hands. The storm would come again, as storms always did. But when it did, she would be ready.